No plus ones, Mom. Those were the words she said, her voice clipped, her eyes avoiding mine. The registry office smelled faintly of varnished wood and stale flowers, and the echo of her words seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. I don't know what I expected when she handed me the invitation, but it wasn't that. It wasn't the sudden, deliberate exclusion that seemed to reduce me to half of a person in an instant. My fingers trembled as I held the envelope, the pale cream card that should have been a gesture of joy and inclusion now burning like a reprimand in my hands. I looked at her fiancé standing beside her. His smile was polite, almost rehearsed, as though he was trying to soften the sting of her words, but he didn't intervene. That silence told me everything. This wasn't just her decision, or if it was one he would not question. I pressed the crease of the card between my fingers and folded it neatly, as if tidiness could hold together the storm that was threatening to tear me open. I tucked it back into the envelope without reading the details. I said nothing in that moment. Perhaps it was shock, or perhaps it was pride. Words hovered in my throat, desperate to escape, but I knew whatever I said would sound needy or bitter. So I did the only thing I could manage. I gave a small nod, as though she had asked me something far less significant, like whether I wanted tea or coffee. She looked relieved, or maybe that's me giving her too much credit. The truth is, she barely looked at me at all. We walked out of the registry office together, but apart. She and her fiancé moved ahead, speaking in low voices about the flowers, the guest list, and some caterer that had just confirmed. I followed a step behind, clutching my handbag, wishing it were heavier so I could anchor myself to something real. The city was loud outside, buses hissing, people talking, the air sharp with the tang of exhaust. Life went on as though my world hadn't just shifted in the cruelest of ways. I wanted to ask why. The question bloomed in me like a bruise. Why am I, your mother, not enough to bring someone with me? Why do you imagine me sitting alone, invisible among the couples, a solitary figure who must not disrupt the symmetry of your day? But I swallowed it. I have learned, after years of motherhood, that sometimes silence is easier than an answer you don't want to hear. The bus ride home felt longer than usual. I sat near the window, clutching the invitation in my lap, staring out as the streets blurred into gray shapes and rushing lights. I thought of all the small sacrifices that make up motherhood, the nights without sleep, the scraped knees I kissed, the lunches I packed, the birthdays I planned, the times I stood in the shadows so she could shine. And now, with one short sentence, she had pushed me back into those shadows again. Only this time, I wasn't sure I wanted to stay there. When I got home, the house felt heavier than it had in years. The silence pressed against me. I set the envelope down on the kitchen table and stared at it, as though it might explain itself if I looked long enough. I boiled the kettle, the ordinary sound of water rushing and steam rising offering a kind of comfort. I poured tea, the simple ritual steadying my hands. I sat, wrapping my fingers around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into me. That's when the tears came, uninvited. They slipped down my cheeks, silent and stubborn. I didn't sob, not then. I just let them fall, one by one, into the tea that grew cold as I stared at the folded invitation. I thought about calling someone, my sister, perhaps, or an old friend, but shame stopped me. How could I explain? How could I put into words that my own daughter had reduced me to an afterthought at her wedding? I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. That the day was hers, not mine. That she had the right to set the rules, even if they hurt me. But the words felt hollow. What gnawed at me wasn't just the exclusion itself, but what it meant, a quiet declaration that I was not truly part of her new life, not in the way I had imagined. I slept poorly that night. I tossed and turned, haunted by fragments of memory, her first day of school, her awkward teenage years, the nights she cried over heartbreak. I remembered her saying, once, that I was the only person who truly understood her. When had that stopped being true? The next morning, I dressed carefully, though I had nowhere to go. I chose a blouse she once said made me look elegant, ironed it until the seams were sharp. It was foolish, perhaps, but I needed to remind myself that I was still someone, still whole, even if she didn't see me that way anymore. I walked to the market, bought myself fresh flowers, white lilies, their scent clean and defiant, and placed them in a vase on the table. As the days passed, I found myself caught between anger and sorrow. I wanted to rage, to tell her she was cruel, ungrateful. But another part of me whispered that if I pushed too hard, I might lose her entirely. That fear was stronger than my anger. So I kept quiet, waited for her to call. She didn't. I noticed little things I hadn't before. Couples holding hands at the park, 2 chairs set at every cafe table, friends laughing in pairs. Loneliness clung to me like a second skin. I had always thought I was independent, strong. But the truth revealed itself in the hollow spaces. I had built so much of my life around her, and now, faced with her distance, I felt like a house with no foundation. Yet there was also something else, an ember of defiance, faint but persistent. It came in small moments, like when I tried on a new shade of lipstick at the chemist and realized it made me look alive. Or when I sat in a cafe alone and ordered cake, ignoring the looks from others who might wonder why I was by myself. I was learning, slowly, that solitude could be both a wound and a weapon. Still, at night, the ache returned. I would sit in the quiet, touching the folded invitation, wondering what it would feel like to walk into that room on her wedding day, surrounded by laughter and love, yet utterly alone. Would I be able to bear it? Would I even want to? By the end of that first week, I made a decision, not yet about the wedding, but about myself. I could not wait for her to see me. I had to begin to see myself again. It was a small step, fragile as glass, but it was mine. And so, on a bright morning when the air smelled faintly of cut grass, I booked a haircut. Something different, shorter, sharper. I watched as the strands fell to the floor, light as feathers, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who had been hiding behind her own hair for far too long. I smiled, not because it solved everything, but because it was a start. That evening, I folded the invitation once more, slipped it into the drawer by my bedside, and whispered to myself, "We'll see." Not with bitterness, not with resignation, but with something I hadn't felt in a long time, curiosity about what might come next. The haircut was only hair, really, but I carried it home like a secret victory. I ran my fingers through the shorter strands, surprised at how different my own scalp felt, how light my head seemed. It was a small change, the kind no one else might notice, but for me it felt like standing a little taller in a world that had asked me to shrink. I caught myself smiling in the mirror as I boiled the kettle that evening. It was a faint, private smile, but it was mine. And yet, even as I tried to relish this sliver of change, the invitation weighed heavily on me. It lay in the drawer of my bedside table, folded with deliberate neatness, but I could feel it through the wood, as if it pulsed there, waiting to be addressed. Each night I opened the drawer for my reading glasses, and my hand brushed against the envelope. I never took it out, but its presence reminded me of the decision I was avoiding, whether to attend, whether to endure sitting alone in a room of couples, whether to let myself be diminished further in the name of her happiness. I busied myself with routines. I told myself I was fine. I walked to the market more often, allowed myself little indulgences, fresh strawberries, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, a scarf in a color I wouldn't normally wear. Each purchase felt like a declaration that I was still here, still deserving of small joys. But loneliness lurked beneath every gesture, creeping in when I returned home and found myself with no one to share the strawberries with, no one to admire the scarf. The house was silent, too silent, as if it conspired with the folded invitation to remind me that my daughter had made her choice. When she finally called, nearly 2 weeks later, her voice was brisk, efficient, threaded with the nervous excitement of wedding preparations. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask about the flowers on my table or whether I had cut my hair. She launched straight into a list of arrangements, the seating plan, the photographer, the color scheme. I listened, murmured small affirmations, though my heart grew heavier with each detail. She spoke of our family as though I were not entirely part of it, as though the definition had shifted without my consent. At one point, she paused. "You don't mind, do you, Mom? About the no plus ones?" The question came casually, like a hand flicking dust from a sleeve. I hesitated, caught between truth and preservation. If I said I did mind, she might grow defensive, might accuse me of being selfish. If I said I didn't, I would betray myself. I chose silence for too long, and she filled it. It's just, we really wanted to be intimate. You understand, right? I forced words through my throat. Of course. She exhaled, relieved, and carried on about the flowers. I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, wondering when I had become so careful with my own child, when honesty had started to feel like a threat instead of a bond. That night, I couldn't sleep. I turned the words over and over in my mind, the way she had said intimate, as if my presence with someone else would somehow tarnish the purity of her day. I thought of all the times she had brought friends home, boyfriends who came and went, and how I had welcomed each one with warmth, setting extra plates at the table without complaint. Was it too much to ask for that same grace in return? I began writing letters then, not to send, not even to finish, but as a way to speak the words I couldn't say aloud. I wrote to her, to myself, to the girl she used to be. I wrote about the nights we spent watching the rain from the porch, about the time she swore she would never leave me, about the promise that mothers and daughters were supposed to hold each other's hands through every change. The ink smeared sometimes when my tears fell onto the page, but I didn't care. It was a private grief, and paper could hold it when no one else would. As the wedding drew nearer, the world around me seemed to thrum with reminders. Shop windows filled with white dresses and silver shoes, magazines flaunted smiling couples, and neighbors spoke about anniversaries and family gatherings. I smiled politely when they asked about my daughter's big day, nodding as though everything was perfect, then walked away with the lie curdling in my chest. One evening, after a particularly long day of silence, I walked to the park. The air was cool, the trees shedding early leaves that crunched beneath my shoes. I sat on a bench and watched the world move around me, children chasing one another, couples strolling hand in hand, a man tossing a ball for his dog. I felt both invisible and exposed, as though the world saw me sitting alone and quietly confirmed what my daughter had declared, that I was meant to be solitary. But then, as the light faded, a small moment shifted something in me. A woman about my age sat down on the bench beside me. She carried a canvas bag filled with books and bread, and without preamble she sighed and said, "These evenings feel longer when there's no one waiting at home, don't they?" I looked at her, startled, and saw the same loneliness etched in her eyes. We didn't speak much, only a few sentences about the weather, the leaves, the bread she had bought. But in that brief exchange, I realized how much I had missed the simple intimacy of being seen, even by a stranger. When I walked home, I felt less burdened. Not healed, not whole, but slightly less invisible. The wedding remained a question mark in my mind, looming larger with each passing day. I couldn't imagine myself there, yet I couldn't imagine staying away. Both choices felt like losses. But as I set the lilies on my table once more, replacing them with fresh ones, I thought of the stranger on the bench. Perhaps I wasn't as alone in the world as my daughter's exclusion made me feel. Perhaps there were ways of belonging that didn't rely solely on her acceptance. Still, at night, when I opened the drawer and saw the folded invitation, the ache returned. I touched it lightly, as if it were fragile, and whispered to myself, "Not yet." The decision would come, but not tonight. And so life went on, in that fragile balance between sorrow and defiance, each day pulling me closer to the moment when I would have to choose whether to step into that room, alone but unbroken, or to turn away and begin building a life that no longer revolved around waiting for my daughter's approval. Her message arrived with a cheerful ping that felt anything but cheerful. "Just locking numbers this week. Quick reminder, no plus ones. Also, can you do lemon tarts? You know, your usual." I stared at the screen, at the smiley face tacked on the end like a bandage that wouldn't stick. I typed and erased, the way I'd been doing for months without realizing it, smoothing over discomfort, trying to be easy, trying to be good. In the end I sent, "I can bring something," because it was easier than writing what I meant. I am not your caterer. I am your mother. And I am not bringing myself wrapped in silence again. I set the phone down and filled the kettle. The kitchen felt smaller today, as if the walls had leaned in while I slept. I took the lemon juicer from the drawer and held it in my hand, its weight a familiar comfort. How many times had I stood here squeezing sunshine out of fruit for school fairs, bake sales, birthdays? The list belonged to a girlhood and a motherhood that had passed through me like weather. I should have felt proud to be useful. Instead, I felt like a reliable appliance being wheeled out when needed and pushed back into the cupboard when the party began. I squeezed 2 lemons anyway, not for tarts but for a glass of water I didn't want. The sourness stung my throat and cleared some fog from my head. You cannot control what people ask of you, I thought, but you can control what you say yes to. I put the juicer away and wiped the counter with slower, steadier strokes than I felt. The lilies on the table had begun to brown at the edges. I trimmed their stems, changed the water, moved the vase into a square of sun, and watched the petals wake a little. It was a small, almost private resurrection. By afternoon, the restlessness had gathered behind my ribs again. I put on my shoes, sensible ones, the kind that make walking feel like an argument you've already won, and went to the charity shop on the corner. I told myself I was just looking for a book or a decent picture frame, but I drifted toward the dresses without meaning to, drawn by a small rack of color that looked like a row of promises. My hand landed on a dress I would not have chosen a year ago, deep green, soft fabric with some sway, sleeves that grazed the elbow like a gentle hand. I carried it to the back where the mirror wobbled, and pulled the curtain around me with a breath I didn't know I was holding. It fit. The mirror, unkind as it often is, offered me something kinder than usual. No one will applaud you in this, it seemed to say, but you won't disappear either. I ran my fingers along the seam at the waist. The saleswoman, round-shouldered, watchful, kind in the way of people who've learned to be, peeked through the curtain gap and said, "That color does something good to your skin." I almost apologized for existing. Then I didn't. I bought the dress and asked for paper, not a bag, because I wanted to carry it home hugged to my chest, the way you carry something alive. On my walk back I passed a florist and doubled back. I bought a thin scarf, olive with a scatter of small cream dots, the kind of pattern you only notice up close. I wrapped it around my neck outside the shop and felt the air change where it touched me. No one commented. No one needed to. It was an interior announcement, I am allowed to choose. I am allowed to have texture. That evening, while the light softened, an old number flashed on my phone. It was your father, sounding like he always had, smoothed by charm, made hollow by it too. He asked after me with a politeness that didn't land anywhere. Then he slid his purpose into the call. About the wedding, he said, I wanted to make sure you knew I'm bringing Angela. There was a misunderstanding with invites initially, but it's sorted. You know how these things are. He laughed lightly, and the lightness rubbed me raw. Angela. No plus ones, except. I sat down because my knees went loose. The chair creaked under my weight and I imagined the sound floating down the line to him and joining his laughter like a willing second voice. I didn't trust my throat, so I said nothing until he said, "You're quiet," as if it were news. "Congratulations on your plus one," I said, and I could hear the flatness of it, the way it took the shape of courtesy without offering any warmth. He talked on for a few minutes, a braid of schedule and logistics and a final, "Good to see you there." When he hung up the room lost sound again, and I was left with the hum inside me, not grief exactly but a careful, growing fury that felt like waking up with both eyes open. I didn't write to my daughter that night. I wrote to myself. I wrote my own name at the top of the page and underlined it twice, then I wrote everything I hadn't been able to say, that it wasn't a rule that hurt me but its aim, its target. That I was tired of being edited down to fit other people's tables. That I wanted to be invited as a whole person or not at all. The words weren't pretty. They shook on the lines. I tore the page out and folded it in half, then in half again, until it was the size of a ticket. I placed it in my wallet behind my bus card. It sat there like a small, hard truth I could touch when I needed to remember the shape of myself. The next morning I took my new haircut to a place where bodies learn to be less afraid of themselves, the community center's beginner yoga class. I arrived early because I didn't want to be noticed arriving, which is one of those small dishonesties we tell ourselves. The instructor was a man the age of my daughter but with eyes as patient as old wood. We began with breathing, which I believed I already knew how to do until my chest surprised me by opening further than it had in months. The mat smelled faintly of rubber and other people's determination. I wobbled, and the wobble didn't shame me. I did not think about lemon tarts. I did not think about table plans. For 40 minutes I lived inside the manageable demand of inhale, exhale, lift, release. After class, while we waited for tea to steep in dull white cups, the woman from the park bench appeared like a twin of a previous evening's gentleness. She recognized me and smiled, not the big kind, the kind that respects a person's edges. "You," she said, tapping her chest lightly. "Bench friend." "I'm Mara." We stood there, not quite strangers, and shared a few small facts that fit into a 2-minute pocket. Her son lived 2 train lines away, she worked at the library, she had learned late in life how to say no and was still practicing. I told her I was still practicing, too. She laughed. "Perhaps we can be each other's rehearsal audience," she said, and the phrase lodged somewhere near my throat where the lemon water had burned the day before. That afternoon my daughter called. "Perhaps the universe is amused by symmetry." Her voice was sugar sprinkled onto something too hard to bite. "Okay," she said, "don't get mad," but we changed seating. "You'll be at table 12 by the doors near the courtyard. It's pretty, actually. Lots of light." I heard the soothing of a child who knows she's doing something that needs soothing. "And can you come an hour early to help with candles and place cards? You're so good at this kind of thing." A long time ago I would have said yes before my disappointment had even finished forming. I took a breath. I placed my palm flat on the kitchen counter because sometimes a person needs to feel a surface holding them up. "I'll arrive as a guest," I said, and my voice surprised me by landing with a small, clean sound. "I won't be able to set up for you." There was a pause, not long, but long enough to add a thin layer to the stack between us. "Right," she said, brightness tightening into something brittle. "Well, we have other hands." The phrase "other hands" made me picture strangers arranging my care in my absence. I swallowed. "Also," I said, and this was the hard part, "your father called. He's bringing Angela." Silence again, a different kind. I let it sit, because I've learned that sometimes silence is not a gap to be filled but a mirror. "It's complicated," she said at last, softly. His side pushed for, "It's numbers, Mom. There are only so many chairs." And she trailed off. "I didn't want you to feel. I thought keeping it uniform would be kinder." "Uniform?" I asked, and I heard the edge in my voice, saw it catch in the air like a wire. "It's not uniform." She flinched audibly. "I know how this looks. Please don't make it harder." I closed my eyes because my anger wanted to run loose and I did not want to let it set fire to everything good that still might be. "I won't make it harder," I said. "I'm telling you how it is. You may decide what you need to. And I'll decide what I need to." She breathed out then, sounding relieved and also as if relief were a luxury she secretly resented me for giving her. We finished the call with the boring practicalities that bodies speak when hearts are too tender to continue. I took a train that evening, not far, just to feel the rails moving under me. I got off 2 stops later near a street of small shops with lights like offerings in their windows. I went into a stationer's and chose a card that was not wedding appropriate at all, a small watercolor of a lighthouse in a storm. I brought it home and wrote inside it not congratulations but what I would want my daughter to know if I couldn't speak clearly on the day. I wrote that I loved her more than my pride. I wrote that I was letting my pride breathe anyway. I wrote that kindness requires specificity, not rules. I wrote that I would sit or stand wherever I sat or stood with my whole self, and that if I stood to leave early, it would be because I was learning not to abandon myself again in the name of keeping the peace. I placed the card in a drawer separate from the invitation. Letters and invitations do different jobs. The next days were quieter. I woke, I watered the plants, I went to yoga twice and walked home by different streets. I bought a small pot of thyme and rubbed its leaves between my fingers until the smell anchored me. I loosened the grip of old habits with practical little rebellions. I moved the furniture in the living room 2 inches, vacuumed behind it, discovered an earring I'd long thought I'd lost and put it in. I made tea in the good cup for no reason. I sat at the table and ate breakfast without scrolling, without filling the space with noise, as if I were my own company and not a pause between other people's needs. Mara and I met again. She pressed a book into my hands outside the library, said it taught her how to keep a small fire going in a cold house without burning the place down. We sat on a bench that wasn't ours but felt briefly so. She told me about the first time she'd said no to her grown children, how she'd gone home and cried in relief and in fear. It gets less terrifying, she said. Not easy. Less terrifying. Her face looked like a compass I could learn to read. I told her about the lighthouse card and she nodded as if I'd told her the weather would hold. I booked a room by the sea for the night of the wedding. A small place, a window I could open, a kettle, a chair facing the view. I printed the confirmation and slid it into my wallet behind the folded page with my name on it. The woman at the hotel's reception called me back to say they'd put a ginger biscuit on the saucer with the tea. I thanked her as if she'd promised me a future. On a rainy Saturday, I went to the market to find shoes that were kind to my feet. The salesman brought out a pair that were soft and steady, and I walked back and forth in them on the thin strip of carpet, listening to the quiet squeak of a promise. I took them home in a paper bag that went translucent at the corners from the rain. I dried the bag on the radiator because some part of me believes in not wasting what has been briefly useful. There were setbacks too, small ones that opened old rooms inside me. A message from my daughter: can you wear navy or gray? Angela has a dress that is, well, we're avoiding certain tones clashing. I typed, I'll wear what I already own, and then erased it because I did not want to turn every sentence into a battle. I put the green dress on the bed and sat beside it, and after a while I laid the olive scarf across the neckline. The colors spoke quietly to each other in a language I could join if I listened. I chose to keep the dress. If the room was made of rules, I could be the soft refusal that did not shout, only endured. The night before the wedding week, I ironed the dress and set it on the back of the door. The steam rose and ghosted the mirror, and in that blurred glass my body looked both stranger and more mine. I polished the ring my grandmother had given me. I wrote my daughter's name on the small envelope with the lighthouse card and placed it on the hall table under the keys, where I could not pretend to forget it. And then, unexpectedly, there was a knock at my door. It was my daughter, hair damp from the drizzle, cheeks flushed in a way that made her look briefly like the child who once ran home across school fields with her shoes muddy and her eyes bright. She stepped inside without waiting to be asked and stood in my hallway as if she was measuring it for a memory. I was nearby, she said, and I smiled at the shared lie. We stood there, foolish, loving, hurt. She looked at the dress on the door and at the scarf and at the lilies whose edges were browning again. She touched the scarf lightly, the way you touch a baby's hand with one finger, and said, "That's pretty." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't enough. It was something. I booked a room by the sea, I said, surprising myself by saying it out loud. For after. She blinked. After? After the ceremony, I said. I'll come. I'll watch you make your vows. I'll listen. And then I'll go to the sea and let the day be what it is without asking more of it than it can give. Her mouth softened, then tensed again. People will notice if you leave. I know, I said. They will notice that I came, too. She looked at me then with a gaze that was not child or bride or judge, just person. You're angry, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm alive, I said. And learning not to disappear. The old habit in her rose up, defensiveness, dismissal, something she had been taught about women like me and how we take up space, and I watched her swallow it, the way a wave draws in before deciding whether to crash. She nodded once, a small bow to the fact that I had said a thing I could not unsay. Okay, she said, and I heard the work the word would have to do in her mouth. Okay. We made tea. We drank it mostly in silence. She told me the florist had trouble with the eucalyptus and that the photographer preferred candid shots, and I told her I had time in a pot by the window and that it smelled like we were safe even when we weren't. She put her head on my shoulder for half a breath the way she used to when she was 7 and had ruined something that could be washed. When she left, she took nothing but her umbrella and left the air in the hallway a little warmer than before. After the door clicked shut, I stood with my palm against it, feeling my own heartbeat through the wood. I washed the cups. I dried them. I folded the dishcloth on the radiator. I took the lighthouse card from under the keys and untucked the flap and added a line, "I will not clap for my own vanishing anymore." I signed it with my name and the one she gave me when she arrived on a hot Tuesday in June, Mom. I sealed the envelope and put it back. That night I slept without dreaming of tables. In the morning, I woke with a clear thing in my chest where the ache had been. It wasn't peace. It was steadiness. I dressed, I tied the olive scarf, I put the ring on, I turned the key in the lock and felt its familiar courtesy. The air outside was rinsed by rain. I walked to the station with my ticket in my pocket and the weight of my decision like a coin I had finally chosen to spend. The morning of the wedding broke pale and thin, the sky a washed-out blue that looked uncertain of itself. I sat on the edge of my bed with the dress laid out before me, the olive scarf folded neatly across the back of the chair. My hands trembled as I fastened my grandmother's ring onto my finger, not with excitement, but with something steadier, resolve. I had rehearsed the day so many times in my head, walking into that room, the faces turning, the awkward glances at my empty side, the polite smiles that wouldn't quite mask the questions. I thought of my ex-husband arriving with Angela, their hands linked, their presence silently permitted where mine had been restricted. The thought cut sharp, but it no longer bled the way it had weeks ago. I had stopped asking why. Some questions didn't deserve my energy anymore. When I stepped outside, the air was cool, damp with the faint memory of rain. Each step toward the station felt like walking deeper into myself, carrying not just my bag but the quiet decision I had made. I would show up, not as a placeholder in someone else's story, but as a whole person in my own. If that unsettled her, if it unsettled anyone, so be it. At the registry office, the air hummed with chatter and perfume. Guests clustered in small groups, laughter bubbling, shoes clicking on the polished floor. For a moment I wanted to turn and walk out, to choose the sea before choosing this. But then I caught sight of my daughter in her dress. She was radiant, yes, but more than that, she was fragile in her radiance, like light held in glass that might crack if pressed too hard. My breath caught, not because of exclusion, but because she was still my child, no matter how far she had pushed me. She saw me then. Our eyes met across the room. Her expression flickered, guilt, relief, and something else I couldn't quite name. She mouthed the word Mom, soft, almost apologetic, as though it were a prayer she didn't know how to speak aloud. I found my seat at table 12, by the doors. It was exactly as she had said, lots of light, though I suspected she hadn't meant it as a kindness. Still, I let the sunlight warm my shoulders, let it remind me I wasn't hidden in shadows. Couples around me chatted, I smiled when appropriate, sipped water, and let the moments pass through me. When the ceremony began, I listened to every word. I held the sight of her face, the tremor in her voice, the way she clutched his hands as though they were her anchor. And in that quiet space inside myself, I realized something simple and profound: I wasn't there to be seen. I was there because I had chosen to witness. And when the vows ended, when applause filled the room, I clapped too, not out of obligation, not out of performance, but because in that moment I was still her mother, and no rule, no absence, no silence could take that truth away. After the ceremony, the room softened into chatter and clinking glasses. Laughter spilled easily from table to table, weaving a fabric I wasn't part of. I stayed seated, folding the napkin in my lap, unfolding it again, letting my hands stay busy so my heart didn't betray me. Across the hall, I saw my ex-husband with Angela, her hand resting lightly on his arm. They looked comfortable, welcomed. No one questioned their presence. I sipped water, pretending it was wine, and felt the truth of my solitude. It wasn't the emptiness that startled me, it was the clarity. For the first time, I understood what it meant to sit alone without apology. The ache was there, of course, but it wasn't hollowing me out anymore. It was simply reminding me that I was alive, present, still capable of choosing myself. My daughter passed by, her bouquet trembling in her hand. She leaned close enough to whisper, "Thank you for coming." Her voice was thick, and her eyes wouldn't quite meet mine. In that moment, all the letters I had written in silence, all the swallowed words and hidden tears, gathered into a single thought: she may never understand the depth of what she asked of me, but she had asked it, and I had endured. I stayed long enough to watch her cut the cake, long enough to see her laughter rise above the hum of conversation. I clapped at the right moments, smiled when her friends turned to include me. But when the music began, and couples drifted to the dance floor, I felt the tug inside me, gentle but insistent, like the tide calling me back to shore. I slipped the lighthouse card from my bag, left it in her dressing room where she would find it later, and kissed her cheek as she spun past me on the floor. She smelled of roses and something I couldn't name, something new, something not mine anymore. And then I walked out into the evening. The air was cooler now, touched with salt from the sea I was heading toward. My shoes clicked softly on the pavement, each step an exhale, each step a release. I wasn't leaving in anger. I was leaving whole. The train carried me away from the registry office and toward the coastline, its windows smeared with dusk. My reflection sat across from me, softened by the glass, looking almost like another woman keeping me company. I traced the faint lines of my face with my eyes, the history there, the love, the mistakes, the resilience, and felt, perhaps for the first time in years, that I was meeting myself honestly. When I arrived at the small seaside inn, the air smelled of salt and wood smoke. I opened the window of my room, and the sound of waves rushed in like a chorus that had been waiting for me all along. The sea was dark, restless, untamed, yet steady in its rhythm. I sat in the chair by the window, scarf draped loosely around my shoulders, and let the tide's repetition teach me something my daughter's words could not, that constancy need not be gentle to be true. I thought of the lighthouse card I had left for her. In time, she would read it. Perhaps she would understand, perhaps not. Children often grow into their parents' sacrifices slowly, as if peeling back layers they once ignored. I could not force that reckoning, nor should I. My role now was different. I had borne enough invisibility. The rest of my life, however long, belonged not to waiting for her acknowledgement but to claiming my own. I made tea in the small kettle, stirring in the ginger biscuit the innkeeper had left. The sweetness dissolved slowly, the steam curling upward. It reminded me of those long years of care, cakes baked for birthdays, teas made for heartbreaks, meals left waiting on the table. None of it was wasted, even if it was not returned in equal measure. Love rarely is. But now, my task was not to give endlessly outward, but to tend the part of myself that had gone hungry too long. The waves crashed harder as night settled. I opened the drawer of the bedside table and placed my folded page, the one with my own name scrawled at the top, beside the inn's notepad. I reread the lines, "I will not clap for my own vanishing anymore," and felt them solidify into a vow. Not an angry vow, but a quiet, enduring one. Before I slept, I stood by the open window and let the wind lift the edges of my hair. The sea stretched wide, a dark expanse that did not need me, did not exclude me, did not demand explanations. It simply was. In that boundless rhythm, I felt something loosen inside me. I was not diminished. I was not alone. I was becoming. When I finally lay down, I closed my eyes with a steadiness I hadn't known in months. The world would continue, my daughter's marriage, her choices, her distances, but so would I. And when morning came, with light spilling over the water, I would rise, pour tea, and begin again. Because I had not left empty. I had left whole.